breaks across a linen wing. Indeed, a day owned by this flying thing. A handsome hero of his homeland soars high above that endless fetid ditch, where millions languish in the hell, the horror. But look at him, mere fabric, wood and wire to keep skin and bones from breakage. More man than machine he is, really. Flying oh so high simply means the fall is farther. Through fire, faulty gas lines, naive daring do, in the end this thing has earned its morbid moniker. This flying coffin lends a war which they call great a glamour that it simply does not have.
The fuse was ignited on June 28th of that fateful year. During a visit to Sarajevo, the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria and his wife were assassinated by Serbian nationalists.
Bullets from a Serb assassin's pistol killed Archduke Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in the late summer of 1914, the powder keg of Europe exploded. Within weeks, more than 1 million German troops had crushed Belgium and were pouring into France. Commanders on all sides quickly discovered that their age-old methods of reconnaissance were now obsolete.
They hadn't envisaged any of what transpired in the First World War. So in the initial charges, both infantry and cavalry, men charged into machine guns, rode their horses into machine gun fire, and were mown down.
In late August, as the German army swung to the east of Paris, British and French pilots flying unarmed craft, not much advanced of this 1909 French-made Blériot, alerted their army commanders that the Germans had left a large gap in their lines. The British and French attacked the exposed flank, bringing the German advance to a halt at the Marne River. A crucial role for aviation, reconnaissance had been defined.
The only danger they faced was their aircraft falling out of the sky because of mechanical problems. There was no way to shoot them down. Of course, then it turned around. A German pilot reported back to his commander that the British and the French were massing at the Battle of Marne, and the Germans then retreated from the Battle of Marne in early September of 1914 and dug in.
The Allies and Germans failed to outflank one another and settled into the infamous trenches on a front that stretched 650 kilometers from the coast of France and Belgium all the way to Switzerland. The front would remain more or less static for the next 3.5 years. It was the aeroplane that owned freedom of movement above the deadlocked trenches, and it began to develop a glamorous reputation.
I think there's something extremely poetic about being up to your neck in filth and human droppings and dead bodies and all the rest, and look up and see these pilots flying through the clean, clear blue sky.
There's a famous quote by this French commanding officer when this British reporter comes up to him on the Western Front in late 1914, and the Frenchman just looks at him and says, "See that? It's that wretched bird that haunts us," because every time they move, the German Taube, which was a monoplane, would follow them. And where the plane went, so did German artillery.
In an effort to protect their troops below, pilots began to develop ways of preventing enemy aerial reconnaissance. Life above the trenches was about to take a violent turn.
Using such weapons as flechettes, which is a steel dart, bricks, Several enterprising airmen even thought about the possibility of taking grappling hooks on ropes, dragging them along behind the aircraft with the hopes that they might snag another aircraft. Of course, one wonders if they did, what would have actually happened to the aircraft itself that was pulling the grappling hook.
The Great War, as it became known, began only a decade after the first motor-powered flight by the Wright brothers. The pilots who took part were older than much of the technology available. Many planes flown in the First World War had no brakes or steerable rudder. They were rudimentary in many ways, but they did embody most of the basic elements of today's aircraft. Tail for stability, wings for lift, engine for power, propeller for thrust, fuselage to contain pilot and payload, and simple mechanisms to operate movable parts needed for controlled flight, rudder, ailerons, and elevators. A stripped-down example of these planes at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum reveals some early genius.
The design of aircraft actually stems from bridge building. If you ever look at the truss work in a bridge, the things that the truss wire do, they also keep the fuselage straight as you're building it so you don't have a twist into it.
Bracing the truss work to keep the fuselage straight is an intricate process. You adjust each joint or turnbuckle to expand or contract the wires.
So as you pull on this wire, it might pull a wire over here, which in turn pulls a wire up here. So it's a very painstaking process of adjusting all the turnbuckles to get it straight.
France had seen the fastest expansion of the aviation industry, particularly the manufacture of aero engines. French designs powered many aircraft in the Great War, on both sides. One engine type, the rotary, was revolutionary in every sense of the word. The first complete break from motorcar engines, its crankshaft was bolted directly to the aircraft structure, so that cylinders and propeller rotated around it.
So they decided, well, let's spin the whole engine, and it'll be its own best fan to cool it.
Fuel flow. Fuel flow.
Compact and air-cooled by its own whirling motion, the rotary engine generated a lot of power for its light weight and vibrated less than early water-cooled models. The efficient performance of the rotary engine allowed pilots to carry handguns, rifles, and eventually machine guns aloft, a major factor in the aeroplane's evolution as an offensive fighting weapon. Pilots at the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome Museum in New York's Hudson Valley still fly several rotary engine aircraft from the First World War.
These are quite powerful for what they weigh. This one is about 325 pounds, and turning at 1,300 RPM, which is quite slow by today's standards, but it creates quite a bit of thrust for an airplane in this size.
It's an engine that doesn't turn, you know, you think of in today's terms of race engines turning at, you know, 10, 12, 15,000 turns a minute. Here it is 12, 1,300 turns a minute. It doesn't turn very fast.
Not much faster than 1,350. The manual says danger of bursting or danger of rupture beyond 1,350 RPM.
Rotary engines had no carburetor to regulate fuel flow and thus engine speed. So to slow down for landing, pilots had to intermittently switch the engine off.
It's certainly one of the most unique sounds you'll ever hear anywhere, to hear this engine running wide open, and then it cuts off. And then it comes back on. And then it cuts off again, and it comes back on. I remember hearing one here for the first time, first one I ever heard, coming down through the parking lot. and hearing this engine, burp, burp, and say, my God, what?
You immediately
is
assume
that?
something's wrong with it.
I immediately knew that something exciting was happening here. But yeah, it's just, you know, it's like getting in your car, putting your foot to the floor, starting the engine, and turning it on and off when you come to the stoplights.
The engine had to be lubricated with liberal quantities of castor oil, which spewed out in a fine spray all over the windscreen, the pilot's goggles, and the pilot himself. Airmen couldn't help but ingest a good amount of the oil, making a trip to the latrines the first port of call after a flight.
But it's a great sound. In the air, I'm sure it's even better.
It sure is, as long as it comes back on.
Turning off's not the problem. Coming back on sometimes can be.
Our mission, our museum mission, is to save technology. So therefore, we have to go down to the last nut and bolt. Well, preserving history you can do by books, photographs, this type of thing. With the technology, we need to go beyond the aircraft itself. 1917, what kind of metals, metallurgy, what type of aluminum, what type of designs in the aircraft engines, and how are these developments progressing. We can take something off of the airplane today and tell you exactly how the steel was manufactured in France back in 1917. So it goes beyond the aircraft itself.
The Garber facility in Suitland, Maryland is tucked away behind the American National Air and Space Museum. It's here that they preserve, conserve, and restore America's aviation history. Like this Nieuport 28 fighter that the restoration team has been working on for 2 years. The Nieuport 28 was the first fighter used in combat by American units after the US entered the war in 1917. Restoring a complicated piece of technology is a meticulous job.
Think of a jigsaw puzzle that's already put together. And you take the first piece out and you number it, and you keep doing this until you get to the very last piece. And then that piece you restore, conserve, whatever you have to do, repair, and then you just go back in reverse order. Seems a little time consuming, but that way we can maintain the authenticity of the aircraft.
It turns out that what's authentic about the Nieuport 28 are some serious design flaws. The American pilot Edward Peck Curtis recalled the faults of the Nieuport 28 in this 1977 interview.
And the Nieuport was a good flying airplane, but it was not a very good fighting airplane. It had a nasty tendency to pull the fabric off the top wing if it dove it too fast. Several people did this, Ringbacher included, but he got down all right.
The French had already decided they didn't want to use the Nieuport 28 because of its remarkable tendency to shed the fabric on its upper wing. The trouble is not when you're simply flying along, but if you try high-speed or relatively high-speed maneuvers, the air pressure then on the upper wing would cause it to shed. The Americans were so desperate for aircraft, they bought whatever the French could provide, and we brought quite a few Nieuport 28s, although eventually we were going to replace them with the SPAD 13, but at that time it was the only aircraft available.
American airman James Meissner, seen here on the left with famous ace Eddie Rickenbacker, remarkably survived 2 wing failures caused by that faulty design. The Garber restoration team found the key to the failures when they took apart the wings. The leading edge of the ribs were merely tacked in place with small nails. Neither glue nor structural supports reinforced them. The design flaw will remain firmly intact for historical reference when the Garber team puts the aircraft back together, painted in James Meissner's colors. First World War pilots had an expected lifespan of 3 to 6 weeks, and faulty aircraft design would contribute to those figures. Stress tests of the day consisted of shoveling sand onto the wings to see how much weight would break them off. Considering that these aircraft flew into combat, their structure was quite fragile. Light wood and wire covered in a fabric skin was coated in a highly flammable sealant called dope. This was the only protection from the elements.
The gas tank, as you see here, is sitting above the pilot's legs. This is a very dangerous place for a gas tank to be, but for its day, this was the height of technology.
Is there some way we could wedge that rag up in there?
Leaky fuel connections still present a problem for the pilots of old Rhinebeck Aerodrome.
Is it leaking or just that's when it's vibrating?
I think it's got a little drip, but I don't mind wedging the cowls up there to stop the vibration a little bit. I just pushed the tank forward.
Eventually, the crew gets the Sopwith Camel airborne. But pilot Gene DeMarco is understandably concerned. The reason he keeps looking into the cockpit is because fuel is leaking all over his legs. Brian Coughlin also faces real terror in the skies. Look to the lower right-hand side of the screen, below the machine gun. The gun has caught fire in a demonstration flight of this German Fokker triplane. After a few tense moments, Coughlin is able to extinguish the flame, and in a landing itself somewhat dramatic, manages to get the aeroplane back on the ground.
The machine gun is not on fire. I'm trying to get the gun to fire. It started firing. All of a sudden, you see that I feel the stress burning on my leg. Off the wall, metal. All off the wrist. Just blowing flame towards the gas tank.
Airplanes of that period did catch fire, not only from the various actions in combat, but just actually everyday flying, due to the materials and the way things were constructed, that they would actually break apart or split, or leak, and then catch fire for one reason or another.
But it was evident early on that the aeroplane's potential as a military tool would far outweigh its dangers. A concept Wilbur Wright championed in 1909 as he hauled his flying machine from one demonstration to another all over Europe. In these first films ever taken from an aircraft, a flight for Italian officials, the reconnaissance potential was obvious. In 1916, one group of American pilots volunteered its services to fight for the French in its own air squadron, or escadrille, a full year before America declared war on Germany. Its members took the name Lafayette Escadrille after a French aristocrat who'd fought with the US in the Revolutionary War. They were a strange and idealistic breed who fought above the battlefields for a lofty cause in an adopted country.
They are the elite of the elite, the creme de la creme. Harvard men, Yale men, University of Virginia men who have decided that it's important enough to sacrifice their lives to protect liberty by protecting France. And what better advertisement for an America that for many of these young men, to them was actually, if not cowardly, at least laggard in getting into this war to end all wars.
Kiffin Rockwell, a medical student from North Carolina. William Thor, ex-Foreign Legionnaire with a damaged knee, poor vision and feeble hearing. Victor Chapman, the well-to-do architecture student from New York State, great-great-grandson to John Jay, who signed the Declaration of Independence. In the coming battles, the Lafayette Escadrille would prove to be welcome reinforcements to the French. who in 2 years of bloody war had over 2 million casualties. The main function of aircraft in the First World War was reconnaissance. Airmen prying behind enemy lines robbed ground troops of the element of surprise and changed the way war was fought forever. They were also concerted attempts to use aircraft to bomb the enemy. Attacks on supplies and infrastructure like railroads and bridges were quite successful. The bombing of cities, however, was less significant, and the psychological effects far outweighed actual physical damage. British pilots demoralized enemy ground troops with strafing runs on German trenches. The most memorable aircraft of World War I was to be the fighter. At first, slow-moving observation planes carried weapons. Then, from the autumn of 1915 to spring 1916, German pilots used armed aircraft more deliberately to attack French and British observation planes in a period that became known as the Fokker Scourge. The key to their success was the replacement of handguns with a new device which allowed them to fire machine guns forward through the propeller arc of their single-wing Fokker Eindeckers. The aircraft was evolving from the purely defensive, where crews protected themselves with a movable machine gun in the rear cockpit, to a truly offensive weapon of war.
With the development of the true fighter plane, the machine gun becomes part of the aircraft.
Ironically, it was the dramatic success of a well-known French airman, Roland Garros, that gave the Germans the idea that machine guns could be fired through their propeller arc. On his aircraft, Garros had attached metal plates that deflected bullets off his blades.
He was able to achieve a number of victories in April of 1915, and when he then crash-landed behind German lines, I believe his engine failed, the Germans then quickly picked up on this technology, improved on it, and the war took an entirely new dimension. And this dimension is this war, this struggle for control of the air.
Rather than deflecting bullets off the propeller, the German system, developed by Fokker, synchronized the propeller and machine gun. The Allies didn't develop a successful version of this gun until later in the war.
When the propeller comes around, it gets about here, this mechanism interrupts the firing mechanism, so it won't fire until the blade gets to about this position. And it keeps rolling around, and when the other blade comes up, once again it stops and starts firing again when you get to the other side, and this continues. You're interrupting the firing sequence at every half a rotation of the propeller.
This new device was so effective that Germany seized air superiority with only about 36 Fokker aircraft, kitted out with synchronized machine guns. British airmen grimly referred to themselves as Fokker fodder. In 1916, a new generation of faster, more maneuverable Allied fighters appeared, which were to challenge the Fokkers. A pioneer among this group was a fast little single-seater biplane called the Nieuport 11. This was flown by the American volunteers of the Lafayette Escadrille. Because it was so compact, pilots nicknamed it the Bebe. With a top speed of 156 kilometers per hour, it was faster, tougher, and more maneuverable than the Fokker Eindeckers. But it could still not fire a machine gun through its propeller arc.
The gun is mounted on top of the wing because it didn't have any kind of synchronizing mechanism. The gun couldn't fire through the propeller arc, it had to fire above it.
You had to fly the airplane with one hand, you had to fire the machine gun with the other, and then you had to use your third hand, I guess, to replace the machine gun drum.
Despite its awkward gun, the superior speed and maneuverability of the Nieuport 11 and other aircraft of 1916 allowed the Allies to dominate their German foes. In February 1916, the Germans launched an offensive on the French fortress city of Verdun, a key position for the Allies. If Verdun fell, the Allied lines would be severed, a potential disaster for the French and British. In desperate fighting that took place over Verdun, and later that year at the Battle of the Somme, the Allies had changed tactics. Instead of the costly method of sending lone reconnaissance aircraft over enemy lines, they now dispatched flights of 3 or 4 fighters to hunt down and destroy German aircraft.
You gang up on your opposing numbers, so you'll try to get 3 on 1 and blow the other person out of the sky. We have some very fascinating accounts of some of the fighter pilots at Verdun. This is a serious battle to the death, both on the ground and in the air. And one of the early French fighter races, a fellow by the name of Albert Deyen, landed one day after an aerial combat with the Germans, and his mechanic observed that his helmet, his goggles, his face, the upper part of his airplane were all covered with blood. And Deyen just matter-of-factly replied, "I shot from very close."
Air combat was becoming more complex and more brutal.
He had been within 10 meters, in other words, 30 feet of the German two-seater that he shot down, and had put about 25 bullets into both of the crew members. And he was very pleased with his accuracy, and he said it was delicious to descend after that combat.
The year-long battles at Verdun and the Somme resulted in well over 1 million killed, wounded, or missing. The aeroplane, as a fighting weapon of war, had come into its own, with new technology and new ways of fighting. The British and French, for a brief and critical time, had closed their airspace to German observation. With the Germans unable to see crucial movements behind the enemy lines, the Allies had held off perhaps the greatest German offensive yet. In these battles, the American members of the Lafayette Escadrille proved to be reckless and headstrong in their pursuit of the enemy. The Americans' aggressive style resulted in nearly 200 kills over the coming months, but 63 of their own pilots were lost. Their commander, Captain Thénault, had worried most about 27-year-old Victor Chapman, the fearless pilot who was first to fly out to every fight and always the last to return.
It was a war of attrition. It was kill or be killed. Now, in the early days of the war, you could salute your enemy. If he ran out of ammunition, you could let him fly another day because it wasn't sporting. But by 1915, 1916, as it really got down to a truly attrition warfare, no one took that chance, that opportunity. You shot and killed your enemy, and no matter what circumstances he was in.
Eventually, 17,000 airmen were to die in the Great War. As if the fear of fire, faulty construction of their aircraft, and the enemy were not terrifying enough for the young pilots of World War I, once they did run into trouble, chances of survival were slim. For much of the war, pilots were not issued with parachutes. Parachutes were too heavy for use in aircraft, and it's commonly understood that British air commanders feared pilots would lose their offensive edge if they had the option to jump.
They didn't want their pilots turning chicken in a perfectly good aircraft by bailing out at the last minute. You know, if they're going to have to force men to go over the top in the trenches at gunpoint to make an attack, they don't want the pilots bailing out. So surprisingly, if they crashed, I mean, there was no way to get out. There was no escape. one of the great American aces flying for the Lafayette Escadrille before America entered the war, Raoul Lufbery, dove out of his aircraft because it caught on fire. And of course he had no parachute, but he jumped out rather than burn to death.
In 1916, German officials, concerned that their air crews were being outperformed by the Allies, called on the expertise of a young ace named Oswald Boelcke.
Boelcke is a master not only at flying and fighting in the air, but codifying the tactics that you use to shoot down the other side. In other words, he's a masterful observer of what he himself does.
Pilots at this point in the war were taught only to fly, not to fight. There were no tactics or training schools. The deadly skies were the airman's classroom. With the help of another pilot, Max Immelmann, Boelcke began to change that and became mentor and instructor to the entire German air service.
What Boelcke and Immelmann tried to develop was the kind of tactics that would allow victory, especially among neophyte pilots who did not have a lot of experience. Their dictums are still used today.
Got 87s and F-14s coming in south of the hill, right on the deck. Talk about that, 210 for 5 miles.
Boelcke developed the concept, still in use today, of flying two aircraft in a basic formation. While one pilot engages the enemy, the other protects him from attack.
Get behind your opponent without his seeing you.
Yeah, Tally Ho, his nose isn't on me, but I'm in deep trouble here. Yeah, we're going to bail you out, man. Okay, he's got about 50 to go with his nose. Okay, drag your knees. Okay. Okay, he's pitched off on the Maybury at back starboard, dog. That's true, you're about to get gunned.
Make certain you have the advantage of height, if at all possible.
Overhead, overhead. I'm back. I can't do anything about it. I ain't okay, 300 knots. I got it. Okay, there's them 5.
Keep the sun at your back so that he can't see you in the sun.
F4 belly, left side, 10 o'clock.
This would say once you join combat, always know your avenue of retreat if you're over enemy lines, if you have to get away. In other words, he wasn't one of these people who would fight to the death against great odds. He knew the name of the game was to get back, to live to fight another day.
Let's knock this one off. How'd you knock it off? Sure, I can knock it off. I think we pressed it pretty good that time.
Boelcke and Immelmann organized the German fighters into units known as Jasters, or hunting groups. Among their hand-picked pilots was one, Manfred von Richthofen, later to achieve notoriety as the Red Baron. The Jasters were equipped with a new aircraft. The Albatros was built with a rigid, plywood-covered fuselage, providing structural strength and eliminating the need for an internal network of wires. The new aircraft was armed with 2 Spandau machine guns and a powerful inline engine. Von Richthofen would score more than 75% of his kills with various Albatros models. On their first combat mission in the autumn of 1916, Boelcke and his men shot down 8 out of 14 British planes without loss. The Germans were to wrench mastery of the air back from the Allies, but they would maintain it for only 1 more year. On April the 6th, 1917, the US Congress declared war on the Central Powers after Germany launched nearly unrestricted submarine warfare. America mobilized troops and industry, while thousands of pilots trained to fly and fight in the final clashes of World War I. Training had to be quick and intensive. The Americans would be flying against units that had nearly 4 years of combat experience, a lifetime considering the age of the technology. What was left of the all-American volunteer unit, the Lafayette Escadrille, was absorbed into the new American Air Arm. Late in 1917, Germany was dominating the skies over Europe with well-trained pilots and aircraft like the Albatros and the famous 3-winged Fokker DR-1. But the Allies were once again about to wrest the initiative away from the Central Powers with a new generation of fighter aircraft. The most famous of these was to be Britain's Sopwith Camel, the first Allied plane to have twin synchronized Vickers machine guns. The Camel would destroy over 1,200 enemy aircraft during the war, more than any other Allied type.
The tremendous torque and centrifugal force produced by that mass of turning steel gave it the ability, as the pilots of the time said, to turn on a dime with 9 cents change.
The power of this efficient rotary engine created a ferocious torque on takeoff, causing many inexperienced pilots to crash.
But once it was learned or mastered, it could be used to your advantage. You could outmaneuver them and get behind them, of course, and it allowed you a clean shot.
It was the Sopwith Camel that would challenge Germany's most famous ace in the later days of World War I, the legendary Manfred von Richthofen. Because he painted both his Albatros and later his triplane red, some say to taunt his enemies, the British dubbed him the Red Baron. On April the 21st, 1918, a dogfight of about 30 aircraft swarmed over the Somme River. The Red Baron, in characteristic form, held back from the fray in his infamous red triplane. He noticed a lone Sopwith Camel break off. The Red Baron flew in for the kill behind the inexperienced Canadian pilot. The lead Canadian pilot saw his comrade's plight and dived at full speed. He swept behind the Red Baron's triplane, firing a desperate burst. The triplane zigzagged wildly, then disappeared behind a grove of trees. The Red Baron, who for years had terrorized Allied pilots, was dead, brought down by an Allied Knight of the Air and his superior Sopwith Camel. For many years, that was the official story, but it may be just a story, like so many myths and legends of aircraft and their aces in World War I. Many now believe Manfred von Richthofen was killed by a burst of ground fire from an Australian artillery unit operating in the area on the day of his death. Not nearly as grand a scenario.
The old pictures of the Knights of the Air with their flying scarves and such, that was simply public relations. The people back home wanted to see those pictures. They did not want to see their troops in the trenches, fighting and dying in the mud where they stood.
Few heroes would emerge out of the mud of the trenches in World War I. Governments on all sides turned to the pilot to boost public morale and encourage support for the war. Airmen of World War I, like von Richthofen, were deliberately depicted as superheroes who flew above and distracted from the bloody slaughter of the 11 million men dying on the ground.
And his primary function during the war, in addition to shooting down 80 Allied aircraft, was to attract the support of the home front. He was constantly being sent back home for parades and for speeches and such. His job was to build support for the war effort. He was a great hero in a nation that needed heroes, considering the casualty figures, the number of dead who were coming back from the trenches. And so in many ways, he was a public relations coup, but on the other hand, he was also a tremendous pilot.
Postcards of favorite aces were passed around like cigarette cards. Air battles were appealing because issues were clearly resolved. When the battle ended, the loser fell to earth. The winner still flew high and away. What was not so widely discussed was that the constant stress of combat took its toll on the Red Baron, as it did on many of the airmen of the Great War. Von Richthofen seemed to lose his edge after suffering a serious head wound which would not heal.
He was pursuing this new pilot who in his earlier days, he would have shot down just like that. But he was having difficulty getting behind him, and he was following him all over the sky. He stopped observing behind him, which you're always supposed to do. And he gets in the range for the guns from the ground and ultimately goes down.
When the British realized that the great Red Baron had been shot down, they gave him a hero's funeral with full military honors. Those close to von Richthofen were perhaps not surprised when they received notification of his death.
His mother observed as the war continued that he clearly was not the same person he had been at the beginning. He's not cocky anymore. It's very clear. His brother's shot down. He sees his men getting killed around him. There are points in time at which the German fighter arm does not have the planes to fly that are of the same caliber as the British and French do. That takes a toll. You try it for a few months, years, watch people die, watch them go down in flames, watch them jump out of planes and end up in these heaps on the ground where every bone in their body is broken. See them get burned to death on the ground and not be able to get out of their cockpits because they can't move. You see them with these horrible wounds that some of them are still flying with. It's not a sport, which is what it was cracked up to be. It's a very brutal business. I think what you see with these young men is that after a point in time, they all know that they're going to die. The question is when and how, and one American put it, I know I'm going to die, I just don't know when, and worrying about when it's going to happen is killing me.
Perhaps the greatest myth of the First World War is that the dogfights of the great aces were crucial to the outcome of the war.
In fact, what air power did in World War I was simply make the war worse. It was not a war winner. And by worse, I mean by they simply made it greater number of casualties because they removed the element of surprise. With surprise, the war would not have lasted nearly as long as it did.
The fascinating thing is that they sometimes forget that what really proved itself in the First World War was tactical air power. In other words, the short-range bombers, the reconnaissance capabilities of these two-seat, single-engine planes, the development of cameras to take pictures in depth of the front line. All these things are very, very important and are important harbingers of the future, that the airplane is going to be very important in future wars.
In 1918, America's first joint air and ground offensive was launched on one of the last German strongholds on the Western Front, Saint-Mihiel, southeast of Verdun. 1,500 British, French, and American aircraft streamed over the lines in early September against half as many German planes. Any kind of individual effort was eclipsed by the huge numbers of attacking forces.
What you see ultimately with Saint-Mihiel is the mass. We're not talking about individual fighter pilots fighting individual battles or individual reconnaissance planes. We're talking about thousands of aircraft being amassed over one area of the front to crush any opposition on the other side.
Ironically, the Germans by now possessed what is considered the premier fighter of World War I, the Fokker D-7. D-7s had thick, internally supported wings, which reduced drag and increased lift. Their high-compression BMW engines made them a tough competitor at high altitudes.
The D-7 was capable of maintaining an altitude of 20,000 feet at this kind of an attitude of attack, so it could fire up into you. And it could hang on the prop and stay there and not lose altitude, which is absolutely incredible.
But the German war machine was now exhausted. Despite operating these excellent aircraft, the air arm did not possess enough fuel or replacement pilots to defend against the Allied onslaught.
We had really learned our stuff, and we shot down a lot of planes. We were experienced, and the Germans at that time, of course, were getting a little low on replacements. So I'm sure the level of their pilot experience at that time wasn't as good as ours by a long shot.
Eventually, victory in the air war was largely tied to numbers. Allied tactics were not that superior. Allied aircraft were not that superior. The real key was numbers. By the fall of 1918, the Allies were able to achieve superiority in numbers of 3, 4 to 1. And the Germans were simply overwhelmed, were simply swamped with new Allied aircraft.
Nothing could counter those odds. and the air and ground battles ended with the capture of nearly 15,000 German infantrymen at Saint-Mihiel.
Infantrymen actually commented, since there were 3 Frenchmen and Englishmen for every 2 Germans, they were bound to win in the end, even if everybody had to be killed to prove it.
The Allies could celebrate after 4 long years of war. With the mutiny of the German Navy and food riots in a dozen German cities, the Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. On November the 11th, 1918, the armistice was declared.
Well, one day, this is about a week before the armistice, the weather was very bad, unusually bad, and we had no thought of flying. We were sitting around the barracks playing Red Dog or something, and we heard the sound of this plane motor overhead. Couldn't believe it. And somebody said, "Gee, that sounds like a German motor." So we whisked out, and here, sure enough, was this Fokker D-7 flying around the field about 50 feet up. And the mechanics came out and started throwing rocks and shooting .45s. And eventually he came around and landed. And we all rushed out to the field, thinking he might try to burn up this airplane or something, which was the furthest thing from his mind. And he got out of the cockpit and quite good English. He said, "Where am I?" And I said, "You're in Verdun, brother." And he said, "Oh, that's too bad. I thought it was Metz." Well, I don't think he ever thought it was Metz. I think he decided the war was over, and this was a good way of getting done with it. We took him out and bought him a lunch.